Misotheism is the hatred of God, or hatred of the gods. In some varieties of polytheism, it was considered possible to inflict punishment on gods by ceasing to worship them. Thus, Hallkel, protagonist of the eponymous Icelandic saga set in the 10th century, as his temple to Frey is burnt and he is enslaved, states that, "I think it is folly to have faith in gods, never performing another sacrifice," a position described in the sagas as gothlaus, godless. Jacob Grimm in his Teutonic mythology observes that, "It is remarkable that Old Norse legend occasionally mentions certain men who, turning away in utter disgust and doubt from the heathen faith, placed their reliance on their own strength and virtue." Thus in the Solarleoth 17 we read of Ebogi and Radiasjalf Sigthoutruthu, "In themselves they trusted." In monotheism, the sentiment arises in the context of theodicy. A famous literary expression of misotheistic sentiment is Goethe's Prometheus, composed in the 1770s. A related concept is dystheism, the belief that a god is not wholly good, and is possibly evil. Trickster gods found in polytheistic belief systems often have a dystheistic nature. One example is Eshu, a trickster god from Yoruba mythology who deliberately fostered violence between groups of people for his own amusement, saying that causing strife is my greatest joy. Some dualist interpretations of Christianity would conclude that demons are gods in those subsets religions. In that context, misotheism is encouraged for 1/3 of all deities but not the other 2/3. The concept of the demiurge in some versions of ancient Gnosticism also often portrayed the demiurge as a generally evil entity. Many polytheistic deities since prehistoric times have been assumed to be neither good nor evil. Thus dystheism is normally used in reference to the Judeo-Christian God. In conceptions of God as the summum bonum, the proposition of God not being wholly good would of course be a contradiction in terms. A historical proposition close to dystheism is the Deus Deceptor of Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, which has been interpreted by Protestant critics as the blasphemous proposition that God exhibits malevolent intent. But Kennington states that Descartes never declared his evil genius to be omnipotent, but merely no less powerful than he is deceitful, and thus not explicitly an equivalent to God, the singular omnipotent deity. Terminology. Misotheism first appears in a dictionary in 1907. The Greek mu iota sigma omicron theta epsilon omicron sigma is found in Aeschylus. The English word appears as a nonce coinage, used by Thomas de Quincey in 1846. It is comparable to the original meaning of Greek atheos of rejecting the gods, rejected by the gods, God-forsaken. Strictly speaking, the term connotes an attitude towards the gods rather than making a statement about their nature. Bernard Schweizer stated that the English vocabulary seems to lack a suitable word for outright hatred of God, even though history records a number of outspoken misotheists believing misotheism to be his original coinage. Applying the term to the work of Philip Pullman, Schweizer clarifies that he does not mean the term to carry the negative connotations of misanthropy. To me, the word connotes a heroic stance of humanistic affirmation and the courage to defy the powers that rule the universe. Dystheism is the belief that God exists but is not wholly good, or that he might even be evil. The opposite concept is eutheism, the belief that God exists and is wholly good. Eutheism and dystheism are straightforward Greek formations from eu and dys plus theism, paralleling atheism. Delta upsilon sigma theta epsilon omicron sigma in the sense of godless, ungodly, appearing e.g. in Aeschylus. The terms are nonce coinages, used by University of Texas at Austin philosophy professor Robert C. Koons in a 1998 lecture. According to Koons, eutheism is the thesis that God exists and is wholly good, while dystheism is the thesis that God exists but is not wholly good. However, many proponents of dystheistic ideas do not offer those ideas in the spirit of hating God. Their work notes God's apparent evil or at least indifferent disinterest in the welfare of humanity, but does not express hatred towards him because of it. A notable usage of the concept that the gods are either indifferent or actively hostile towards humanity is in the Cthulhu mythos of H.P. Lovecraft. Maltheism is an ad hoc coining appearing on Usenet in 1985, referring to the belief in God's malevolence inspired by the thesis of Tim Maroney that, even if a God as described in the Bible does exist, he is not fit for worship due to his low moral standards. The same term has also seen use among designers and players of role-playing games to describe a world with a malevolent deity. Antitheism is direct opposition to theism. As such, it is generally manifested more as an opposition to belief in a god than as opposition to gods themselves, making it more associated with anti-religion. Although Buddhism is generally considered to be a religion despite its status with respect to theism being more nebulous, antitheism by this definition does not necessarily imply belief in any sort of god at all. It simply stands in opposition to the idea of theistic religion. Under this definition, antitheism is a rejection of theism that does not necessarily imply belief in gods on the part of the antitheist. Some might equate any form of antitheism to an overt opposition to God, since these beliefs run contrary to the idea of making devotion to God the highest priority in life, although those ideas would imply that God exists, and that he wishes to be worshipped, or to be believed in. Certain forms of dualism make the assertion that the thing worshipped as God in this world is actually an evil impostor, but that a true benevolent deity worthy of being called God exists beyond this world. Thus, the Gnostics believed that God was really an evil creator or demiurge that stood between us and some greater, more truly benevolent real deity. Similarly, Marcionites depicted God as represented in the Old Testament as a wrathful, malicious demiurge, theodicy. This theistic speculation arises from consideration of the problem of evil, the question of why God, who is supposedly omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, would allow evil to exist in the world. Kuhns notes that this is only a theological problem for a eutheist, since a dystheist would not find the existence of evil to be an obstacle to theistic belief. In fact, the dystheistic option would be a consistent non-contradictory response to the problem of evil. Thus Kuhns concludes that the problem of theodicy does not pose a challenge to all possible forms of theism. This conclusion implicitly takes the first horn of the Euthyphro dilemma, asserting the independence of good and evil morality from God. Historically, the notion of good, as an absolute concept, has emerged in parallel with the notion of God being the singular entity identified with good. In this sense, dystheism amounts to the abandonment of a central feature of historical monotheism, the de facto association of God with the summum bonum. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "This world could not have been the work of an all-loving being, but that of a devil, who had brought creatures into existence in order to delight in the sight of their sufferings." Critics of Calvin's doctrines of predestination frequently argued that Calvin's doctrines did not successfully avoid describing God as the author of evil. Much of post-Holocaust theology, especially in Judaic theological circles, is devoted to a rethinking of God's goodness. Examples include the work of David R. Blumenthal, author of Facing the Abusing God, and John K. Roth, whose essay, A Theodicy of Protest, is included in Encountering Evil. Live options in theodicy. Everything hinges on the proposition that God possesses, but fails to use well enough, the power to intervene decisively at any moment to make history's course less wasteful. Thus, in spite and because of his sovereignty, this God is everlastingly guilty, and the degrees run from gross negligence to mass murder. To the extent that people are born with the potential and power to do evil things, credit for that fact belongs elsewhere. Elsewhere is God's address. Deus Deceptor. The Deus Deceptor, deceptive God, is a concept of Cartesianism. Vicious accused Descartes of blasphemy in 1643. Jacques Triglandius and Jacobus Revius, theologians at Leiden University, made similar accusations in 1647, accusing Descartes of holding God to be a deceiver, a position that they stated to be contrary to the glory of God. Descartes was threatened with having his views condemned by a synod, but this was prevented by the intercession of the Prince of Orange. The accusations referenced a passage in the first meditation where Descartes stated that he supposed not an optimal God but rather an evil demon, Summa Potens and Calidus. The accusers identified Descartes' concept of a Deus Deceptor with his concept of an evil demon, stating that only an omnipotent God is Summa Potens, and that describing the evil demon as such thus demonstrated the identity. Descartes' response to the accusations was that in that passage he had been expressly distinguishing between the supremely good God, the source of truth, on the one hand, and the malicious demon on the other. He did not directly rebut the charge of implying that the evil demon was omnipotent, but asserted that simply describing something with some attribute that in reality belongs only to God does not mean that that something is being held to actually be a supreme God. The evil demon is omnipotent, Christian doctrine notwithstanding, and is seen as a key requirement for Descartes' argument by Cartesian scholars such as Alguier, Beck, Émile Breyer, Chevalier, Frankfurt, Etienne Gilson, Anthony Kenny, Laporte, Kemp Smith, and Wilson. The progression through the first meditation, leading to the introduction of the concept of the evil genius at the end, is to introduce various categories into the set of dubitables, such as mathematics. Although the hypothetical evil genius is never stated to be one and the same as the hypothetical Deus Deceptor, the inference by the reader that there is a natural one, and the requirement that the deceiver is capable of introducing deception even into mathematics is seen by commentators as a necessary part of Descartes' argument. Scholars contend that in fact Descartes was not introducing a new hypothetical, merely couching the idea of a deceptive God in terms that would not be offensive. Paul Erdos, the eccentric and extremely prolific Hungarian-born mathematician, referred to the notion of Deus Deceptor in a humorous context when he called God the supreme fascist, who deliberately hid things from people, ranging from socks and passports to the most elegant of mathematical proofs. A similar sentiment is expressed by Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in reference to the temptation of Adam and Eve by God. God puts an apple tree in the middle of the Garden of Eden, and says, "Do what you like, guys. Oh, but don't eat the apple." Surprise, surprise. They eat it and he leaps out from behind a bush shouting, "Gotcha." It wouldn't have made any difference if they hadn't eaten it, because if you're dealing with somebody who has the sort of mentality which likes leaving hats on the pavement with bricks under them, you know perfectly well they won't give up. They'll get you in the end. Scripture. There are various examples of arguable distheism in the Bible, sometimes cited as arguments for atheism, most of them from the Pentateuch. Thomas Paine wrote in The Age of Reason that, whenever we read the obscene stories, the voluptuous debaucheries, the cruel and torturous executions, the unrelenting vindictiveness, with which more than half the Bible is filled, it would be more consistent that we called it the word of a demon than the word of God. But Paine's perspective was a deistic one, critical more of common beliefs about God than of God himself. The New Testament contain references to an evil God, specifically the prince of this world, or God of this world, who has blinded the minds of men. Mainstream Christian theology sees these as references to Satan, but Gnostics, Marcionites, and Manichaeans saw these as references to Yahweh himself. References to God as wrathful or violent are more sparse in the New Testament than in the Old, but a number of antitheist speakers, notably Hitchens and Matt Dillahunty, have drawn attention to a number of passages